Okay, we are back. We've been having a conversation with Roslyn Fuller. So far, we've talked through her top priority, a direct digital democracy. But now we're on to priority number two, universal basic income, a very popular subject on the channel. But I'm curious, Roslyn, why does universal basic income strike you as such a necessary economic social service?
There's two reasons. The first is that I do agree with, Andrew Yang. I really liked his campaign because he's looking forward, right? And if we look forward, we don't really see a return of large scale factory based union jobs.
Mm-hmm.
We see more of a flexible economy. We see probably an economy where, as people live longer, they may want to, rather than just go from a full time job to no job, for example, to working part time or working in flexible arrangements, in the later years of their lives, on and on and on, right? So I do think universal basic income is very useful for facilitating that flexible work life
Mm-hmm.
arrangement, as opposed to social programs, which can be very, very bureaucratic and which can often entrap people in the sense that people are afraid. This is definitely something in Europe. People are afraid to go back to work because then they'll lose their benefits. So sometimes people have, even medical conditions where sometimes they're able to work and sometimes they're not, but they try not to work because they don't want to lose their benefits, and they're afraid that they won't be able to get them back if they do. So I do see universal basic income as just being the way forward, from a pure economic sense, in a more flexible economy. What I also think about it is that in ancient Athens, the participation numbers, as I'm saying, in democracy were very, very high, but people were actually paid to do that. So rather than going and voting and that having to be something where you might even have to take time off work and maybe even have a pay cut, lose some pay for that time, they said, fine, you're doing the work of governing. You should get a bit of compensation for that. It wasn't much. It was probably below, it was maybe like, maybe what it would be like maybe $50 or $60, maybe a little bit more. Um, but it was enough to at least make sure you didn't take a big economic hit for that. So what I think we could really use universal basic income for is to compensate people for that time they spend uh, participating in a democracy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I do wish even Yang had brought up something like that, the idea of pay for participation, because I don't know about you, but the act of helping people like in Iowa try and get out to vote, it's just inconvenient. Think about those people who currently have to go and spend hours of their time caucusing potentially. That is work. You're going and you're trying to persuade people to your positions. Often you're not going to have poor individuals be able to do that because they're working multiple jobs. You're having mothers and fathers have to find childcare for their kids so that they can participate. So I strongly agree with you that it is a job just being a citizen and voter of a country. So I think that's a really important point. One thing I wanted to drill down more into is you mentioned how a lot of the means testing is really cumbersome to a lot of the individuals who are receiving this economic benefit and it's creating perverse economic incentives. Why do you think the existing welfare programs are so inefficient? Is it just the fact that they require the paperwork? Is it the incentive structure, or is it kind of all of the above?
Yeah, I think all of the above. There is certainly a lot of paperwork that goes into it, at least over here, and it's often very confusing as well. If you have many different potential entitlement programs that you may or may not qualify for. It's exhausting to deal with it, and it's often very, very confusing for individuals to know what they qualify for and what they don't qualify for. So often, even there's like an almost industry of NGOs, trying to help people
Yeah.
realize what they are qualified for and what they're not qualified for. And it can be unfair sometimes, because sometimes people might fall through the cracks. An issue we have here, which is it's not entirely related, but for example, an issue people are having at the moment is that, as people get older, if you have cancer or if your parent has cancer, then that's covered often by medical systems. Their care would be covered by medical systems. But if they have dementia, it's kind of on you to look after them, and that can be extremely expensive, for example. But it's an example of something that's quite comparable, right? You have a long-term illness that's very, very serious, somehow you have to have medical care or nursery home care, or whatever. And in one case you're covered, and in another case you're not. So this is the same thing you see with, various entitlement programs. Sometimes you're covered, sometimes you're not. It's just these very, very strict criteria, and then it doesn't motivate you to maybe to do something entrepreneurial or something else you might do with time that may be more limited. You have to fit in with an employer's idea of what you're doing. And of course, employers tend to like full-time work over more than full-time work usually.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I really like your point about how these means tested programs largely create this need for NGOs to even promote them. It's kind of a weird concept to need admin on top of admin for these programs compared to just giving a universal benefit across the board so that they don't need to exist in the first place. With that being said, I'm kind of curious how you foresee a universal basic income coming to be constructed. What types of things should we be using to fund such an idea?
Oh yeah, that's really interesting because I ran as a candidate, as an independent candidate in two elections in Ireland, and I used a software actually to connect with potential voters and ask them what they supported, and we did get a majority that supported universal basic income. So then I asked, okay, like how should it be funded, right? Because it is the hard question. Something people were quite open to actually was nationalizing natural resources.
Hmm.
So, for example, in some parts of the world, and in Alaska, of course, is a good example, is that people get paid a dividend from the natural resources there, and that happens in other parts of the world as well. And in Norway, they use oil revenues to fund their retirement system. So it's kind of a form of that, like a slightly different form, but the idea is there. So that was something that was quite popular. Would probably help if we had more natural resources
Yeah.
in Ireland, but it was something. I think another thing is that I really don't think, and this is a much more controversial thing, is that I really don't think people should be allowed to inherit massive amounts of wealth. I really think that it's kind of against the whole idea of capitalism, in my view, that some people start life maybe inheriting hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equity, or property, and some people don't, right? I mean, you can just never make that up in your life. It doesn't matter how hard you work, you're not going to get there, right? So I think in the interest of having a more fair playing field, inheritance tax should be very, very high. Other than, of course, sentimental, things, your family home and things like that. But other than that, I think inheritance tax should be very, very high, and I think that should be distributed among the population.
Yeah, I like both of those ideas. My one concern would be having something that provides a little bit more regularity, because in the case of like something like inheritances, you can't easily predict when someone's going to die that's super wealthy, and so similarly with natural resources, it tends to be a very volatile industry. It's a large reason why you have countries like the Venezuelas of the world that went under because they invested entirely into the oil industry after nationalizing it themselves. So I totally agree with using those two, but I think potentially it needs more than that. I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think a universal basic income needs to be fully funded?
Yeah, I do. Yes, I think that it needs to come up. Well, I think it needs to come up to the level of what you could expect in retirement. Like for most of for okay, so I'm from Canada originally, right?
Hmm.
In Canada and in most of Western Europe, I think retirement is pensions are basically the biggest drain, if you want, on uh, public, funding in the sense of payments being made regular monthly to people. So yeah, I think it has to at least cover like the minimum of that. I don't see the point of a universal basic income that doesn't come up to that level because you're not going to be able to switch people over to it otherwise.
Yeah, the one reason why I see that you can have a small amount that isn't fully funded is it's not terrible to have just some direct stimulus spending into the economy, taking on that potential debt at times, to be able to say, a little inflation is okay. But I largely agree that it needs to be mostly fully funded. One of the things I'm curious about, this largely became a debate for Andrew Yang's campaign regarding his freedom dividend. is that we talked about beforehand how inefficient these means tested programs are. But do you believe that the program of a universal basic income should be supplemental to those programs, or should people have to opt out of those programs to receive a universal basic income?
Yeah, I wouldn't even see it as opting out. Like my view on it is more that this should be equivalent or better, but at least equivalent to the maximum amount you would get under a program. So that's why I said for us, usually it is pension payments, usually. But whatever that happens to be, yes, I do think so because I think like otherwise you're not having those savings and those benefits of not having to deal with that myriad bureaucracy anymore. To get back to one of your other questions though about funding, I mean, for the United States, of course, you have an enormous defense budget, right?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to fund things more to have that security, then you could dip into that, for example, and cut back on your enormous defense budget that you spend, like
Oh
probably not
yeah.
as much effect
Yeah, we're
in a lot
just
of
defending
ways,
against
right?
other things. We're investing at home instead. I think that makes a ton of sense as well.
Well,
Uh,
you probably could get the same. I think you could probably get the same amount of military power with less money, right? Because it's gotten pretty bloated. So you probably could just demand more efficiency in those kind of things.
I strongly
Also,
agree.
if you spread your kind of portfolio, if you want, among different things, like you could say inheritance tax, you could say um, like um, Tobin tax, for example, right, which means a tax on speculation. Yes, those things will fluctuate, but they probably won't all fluctuate at once. So you kind of have spread your risk a little bit more.
Hmm. I'd be curious in this level that we're trying to set. Do you believe that the level of a universal basic income should be something that someone can self-sustain on, or should they need another maybe part-time income to supplement to sustain on? Because I think one other detraction that people made from Yang's proposal is that $1,000 a month in certain areas is just not enough.
It's definitely not enough in certain areas, but I guess you could move if you wanted to, right? So I do think it should be enough to live on, but I don't think it needs to be enough to live on in Manhattan.
That's true. That's
Right?
true. People
I mean,
don't consider that all the time. Yeah.
if you want to, you could move to Montana. I think it should be enough to basically live on. I mean, as I say, I'm from Canada. I live in Europe. I've lived in states that have welfare all of my life, right? So I've although there's definitely a stigma to being on social welfare, there's not such a thing in the countries that I've lived in as not having that. So everyone in these states lives with that expectation that you will have a minimum to get by on if you want it. And I do think that that should be a minimum that you can expect not to you can expect to have be able to provide a house. You can expect to be able to feed yourself at the minimum.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I never understood why it should be just a subsistence living. It should just, if you're really having your job be automated, you're gonna need something to survive while you're going through that transition. And a
Well,
thousand dollars a month is not gonna help in New York necessarily as much as Montana, but it definitely is a start to get there. One question I have on this is in terms of incentives. Um, do you think that this should be a program that's extended to all citizens, regardless of incarceration potentially?
oh, you mean while someone is in prison, they would get this
Yeah,
payment?
is there any reason why a citizen should not receive the dividend?
That's really interesting. Well, first, let me say I do think that the incarceration rates in the United States are quite appalling.
Yeah, absurd.
So I do think there are a lot of people in jail in the United States who shouldn't be in jail in the United States or shouldn't be in jail for as long as they're in jail. So that's something I would definitely like to criticize that. Other than that, though, let's imagine you had a different system where people were only imprisoned after due process of law for good reason, for things that definitely it was agreed upon by the society that definitely was a crime. You murdered somebody, for example. Then I do think, yeah, you could take away those rights. I mean, people sometimes don't have the right to vote in some countries
Hmm.
after they've been in jail or if they commit certain offenses. So I don't see a problem with that. I don't see a problem with it while they're in jail. I don't think it would be okay to punish them for the rest of their lives by taking that away from them for the rest of their lives. Maybe while they're actually in the prison.
Yeah, I think that's pretty a reasonable position. I hope we can reach that more idealistic sense of our criminal justice system so it's less of a problem. But I worry that if we are taking away the dividend while people are in jail in our currently non-ideal system, that it's going to have some level of racial bias to it as it already does, and it's going to further exacerbate economic inequality so that the people who are just coming out of prison, well, they are at a much bigger disadvantage trying to get back on their feet again because they didn't get all those years of the dividend. So I personally stand that they, at least the non-violent who are in jail, should receive it. But I think I would go further and just say it should be a universal benefit, like I think voting should be as well. I don't think we should be taking votes away from people who go to jail because, again, that disenfranchises largely minority communities in the present. Do you think that there's a reason why we should be taking away these basic rights when we enter the prison system potentially?
Well, I do agree with you. I think the United States justice system is so screwed up that I wouldn't be, I feel like people are so punished in the US sometimes for what are very often what would be considered in other countries extremely minor, offenses, if any, that I kind of don't advocate punishing people even more than that because I feel that it's already quite extreme. I feel like in an ideal world or maybe in a different country, we'd be having a different debate, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I would agree that as things stand, I would agree with you. I mean, potentially in a as you say in a better world, maybe it would be different and maybe it would be okay to do that. I mean, one thing, of course, you think of is that while someone is in jail, of course, they are being housed and fed. So,
That's true too.
um,
Yeah.
therefore, that is at the state's expense. Now, again, let me just say that in American prisons, people are often made to work. So you kind of come back around full circle. I think the issue with the entire prison system in the U.S. is that there are deep, deep problems with the prison system. There is huge problems with discrimination in the American justice, or rather, not so justice system. And I think those things have to be rectified quite apart from any debate about universal basic income.
Yeah, no, I totally feel you there. I think that it's kind of something where in the interim, while we're also needing to do criminal justice reform, maybe we go with a more universal approach. But then as it goes on over time, maybe we scale it back to, okay, in certain instances, yes, this can be pulled from you. And I think you're right. Like maybe we just use the universal basic income funding that an individual would receive and send that to the prison itself to help fund that because they're already getting housed. Um, the last question I really wanted to discuss on the subject of universal basic income before we get to economic inequality, which is a somewhat related subject, is where do you think like the movement is going from here to help get universal basic income across the finish line? Because there's been a ton of pilot programs, but there hasn't been a large scale national effort to implement a universal basic income.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, this is actually an idea that's been circulating around academia for decades. And there have been experiments going back to the 70s at least that show that universal basic income has a lot of benefits for the people who have received it. Benefits in health, benefits in education, benefits in people being able to get out of abusive relationships, things like that. So where do we go? Yeah, well, I think that there's been enough experimentation. I think that the benefits are quite obvious. There are people who are now running for, I think, congressional seats
Mm-hmm.
and in other elections that promote universal basic income. I would say, support those people definitely. The problem is we have is with wanting to do these reforms, we do run up against a very lethargic kind of establishment system, right? And you can either try to gain power in that system, like ASEAN is doing and as people are doing, or have some kind of a full scale revolution.
Yeah.
Uh, so those are really your only two options, right? In the system or out of the system, basically. So as far as going within the system, I would definitely advocate, supporting congressional candidates or, considering running yourself on these things because that's the only way it's ever going to be implemented. I think is if you grasp control of those kind of levers of power and roll out a program like this, which would be a big change. It would be probably the biggest game changer in American like politics since the New Deal, if you did
Yeah,
something
for
like
certain.
this. So it does require a lot of coordination. And I think, people like Yang's obviously in his 40s, so he's quite young. I think a big problem in our system is that, much as I love Bernie, I really like Bernie, but there are a lot of quite elderly people
Yeah.
in politics, and, and not enough younger people getting involved. And it now seems that 40 is super young for some reason, when it used to be pretty old, actually.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, the issue. And I hope that in the coming years, I'd say, like, don't give up. I mean, yes, okay, Yang did better than anyone thought he was going to do. I was supporting Yang like ages ago when he first kind of came, because Scott Santos actually came to a conference we did in Ireland. So we've kind of been involved in these kind of ideas for a long time. And I supported him, and everyone said, people were saying what a joke it was and that he wouldn't get anywhere, but he did get a lot, pretty far. I mean, he did pretty amazing. So the trick is, I think, just to kind of go back and build on that and kind of build that movement up again. And maybe he would run again in the future, or a candidate with similar policies would run again in the future.
Yeah, I kind of expect that he will try at least one more time to run for presidency himself. And it does have somewhat of a testament that individuals like yourself, who aren't even Americans, are very well aware of Yang. That speaks to how well he's doing, that it's not just a national movement, but an international movement as well, universal basic income. And I also will say, in terms of the advocacy, you're right that it always comes down to external organizing around a subject area versus internal organizing going within the systems. The one thing I will say, though, is that the external always ends up needing to go internal, because
Yeah.
you can create pressure from the outside, but it doesn't matter. You need someone from the inside to eventually write it. So I strongly agree with your point that we need to support the people who are already stepping up and running, because without them in place, no one's going to write it, and all we're doing is making noise on the outside. But I will love to talk about this more when we get into your third subject, which is very related to universal basic income, in economic inequality and laying out the foundations for a real democracy. So, Rosebuds, we're going to take a quick break. Join us back in part 3, where we're going to talk about economic inequality.